Notion just dropped a new update for their databases, and in this video, I want to walk you through everything you need to know about it. First up, this is not about granular database permissions. We still have to wait a little bit for that feature. To understand the new change, we first need to look at how Notion used to organize databases. And it's basically this two-tiered structure. For a database, right, we can either have an original instance or a linked view. In practice, this means, right, when you create a database, you will have an original version somewhere, and then you can create any number of linked views of that original database across your workspace that shows the same underlying data. It's what powers pretty much every scalable Notion system, right? And it's one of the most important things you need to understand. That's why in all our long tutorials or when we work with clients, we always teach them that they need to set up their original databases ideally in a separate backend and then only use linked views throughout the workspace so they have a clear separation between the kind of data backend and the actual interface that they interact with. That's really important because, as you know, it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out whether what you're looking at is a linked view or the original. Here, right, we have currently the name of the database, right? If I just rename this to, let's say, demo CRM, right? We, of course, as long as we show the database title, see that this is a linked version through the arrow. But the second we hide the database title, which is what we usually do, right, in order to make the views a bit cleaner, well, now just by looking at this, we can no longer tell. We would need to go into the settings, and then here we see, okay, this has a source, so it is a linked view, whereas this doesn't have a source, so it's the original. And it's so important to know whether something is a linked view or the original, because of course we often rebuild Notion, and that means we often delete linked views, right? We might want to remove that here and move it elsewhere. And deleting a linked view is absolutely no problem, right? But if you accidentally delete your original, well, then all your data is gone. So that's just one of many reasons, right, why we want to have always the original instance of a database separate in the backend. Another thing that we always teach is that your original instance should actually be a full page database, right? So we usually don't want to have this inline, which is what's happening right now, right? We have it inline of a Notion page. We can add all our headings, above this line text, and so on and so on. We reserve that for linked views who are part of the interface, whereas the original instance, right, we usually turn this into a page and then we create a page also, where we say, okay, this is my backend, and then we move everything from all our databases in there, so we have a clear overview of them. And then when you open a database, right, it opens the original one as this full page element. You can't add any other Notion elements to it, but you have this distraction-free setup for your, well, original data source. Now, understanding this concept, right, of your original database and the linked views was already quite complex. It was probably one of the things that's most complicated when you first start using Notion. By the way, if that's you, I have a complete beginner tutorial linked for you in the description that will explain everything to you in just 46 minutes, so you never have to wonder about these things ever again. Link below in the description. But back to the topic, right? This always was a complicated topic, and now it's unfortunately getting a little bit more complex. This is how you now need to start thinking about Notion databases. And we can ignore this part for now because actually that doesn't really change. It's just a different way of looking at it. But the major change happens here on the database container side. Basically, unlike before, whenever you add a database to your system, right, so an original instance, you have now a container that can contain not just one, but several data sources. And every single data source can be its own independent database, right? So whereas before we had basically just database 1 and database 2, and they were all floating independently, but we would just recommend you put them in your backend. You now have the option to create this database container, and this database container can contain your database 1 or your database 2. And again, Notion calls these individual databases data sources in their setup. So we'll see what will be the easiest way to refer to them, but probably we'll go with that in the future as well, right? And refer to it as a database container with several data sources. Now, how does this actually work in practice and affect your workflows? Well, let's just add a new database here, right? As an inline one to keep things simple. And let's call this my demo contacts. Unlike before, or just like before, I can now go ahead, right, and I can create some properties for my contacts. For example, I could create the phone number, right, of that person, and I could create like maybe a text property for their title. Perfect. But what I can do now as well is I can go into the settings of my database, and you see that even though this is the original version, right? It calls it now a source. And I can go to manage data sources. And under manage data sources, I can add another source. And so, right, we really need to think of this here as of the block that I've added as the container. And now I can, besides demo contacts, add more databases into the same Notion block. So let's do this, right? Let's add a data source and let's call this new empty temp data source. Let's call this demo companies. And here you see I have a free set of properties, right? This is not a new view for my first database. This is completely independent. And we see this if I go to my properties, right? I don't see the other properties here. So for a company, right, what might I have? I might have something for the industry, let's call it that. And I might maybe have, if this is my CRM, a status property. And you see now that I have 2 times this table tab up here, and I can switch between them. And this actually changes the name of the database that is displayed here, right? Because it's 2 different databases. We also see it if we hover over a view, right? We see now, okay, this is from demo companies, the table view, and this is from demo contacts, the table view. So that's what's going on here. We added this new container to the page, which, by the way, going forward, anytime you add a database to your workspace, right, it will automatically be a container, so you don't need to do anything special for that. And now we can add several sources below it. Now, this doesn't have to change anything in your workflow, right? You can keep using Notion just the way you did before, where you simply go into your system and you add individual databases one by one, right? Nothing stops you from just saying, okay, database inline, right? This is sort of my first, let's create a new first database, right? This is my first database and I create a new one. This will be my second, right? And you can keep doing it just like before. You don't need to use this new feature. But if you wanted to, right, you could start combining now your original versions of databases into these containers to keep them together. On the other side of the equation, right, in terms of linked views, nothing actually really changes. And just updated our flowchart from before where we have, just this duality to also a similar style, right, left and right, 2-tiered system, so that we have an easier reflection of this new general structure. Because actually, if we think about linked views already behaved like this container, right? Because already before, what you could do is if you created a linked view of a database, you could say, okay, actually, for my linked view, right, I would like to see my demo tasks here in the first one. And then you could always click on plus, add a new view, and then pick a different data source for the other one, right? You could have in a linked view collection, you could have your tasks in toggle 1 and your projects in toggle 2. Right, so here I just added another table view, and you see now I can not just pull in other views from demo tasks, but I can also just look for any projects, right, that I wanted to pull in. Maybe let's just pull in this here as an example, and then we see, right, a similar behavior here. If I tap between those, right, I see, okay, here are my demo tasks, here are my quick projects, and I see them in the same block. So in some way, Notion actually just adjusted the main database block to behave in the same way as the linked views blocks. Now, let's add maybe a bit of confusion, maybe a bit of more clarity to it. The sort of 2-tiered system is how I would like to encourage you in general to view about it, to keep our original best practices of keeping your data source and your linked views separate from one another. But actually, in fact, the way that the new Notion system works is that your database container can contain anything now, right? You simply have this container and it can have data sources or it can have linked views. And this can get messy real quick. And I just want to show you what I mean by that. Let's go back to our Notion page. Right, and down here, this is where we had set up, right, our demo tasks option. This is currently only linked views, right? None of them are the original. But what we can do is we can, of course, now go into settings, manage data sources. And you see we can either link to an existing one, right? That basically does the same thing like we did before, right? We just show it here. So I could go in here, right? And I could say, okay, the demo contacts, let's also show them down below. So perfect, right? All good. We have now our 3 linked views in the same database container, just like before. But I can also go in and say, add a data source. And that creates a new one. So this would be, let's call this demo clients for whatever reason. Let's create this as a data source. And now you see I have my linked view, and an original instance in here. And the reason, right, why this can get confusing very quickly, just from a user perspective, is, well, can you delete this whole thing here now? Right? What happens if I delete this whole block? Well, if I do, as we can see, right, not just do we remove the linked block, the linked views, which doesn't really impact anything, but we also delete one original instance. And luckily, we get now this little pop-up, right, that notifies us that, oh, you're about to delete actually data, not just a UI element. But you see how quickly this can get out of hand if you start mixing your actionable views on a page and your data sources. So even though this right side here, right, is the reality of what you can do, I would highly, highly recommend that you keep building your Notion systems with this duality of separating your data sources from the link views that you actually use across your workspace, and that you keep all your data sources just like before in a central backend to avoid this problem, right? There should never be a confusion when you look at a database like this. Of course, you also want to name this better instead of just table. But there should never be a confusion whether what you're looking at is the original, the actual data, or just a linked view. So that's the very first important point that I want you to take away from this video. Second, and that's probably the other big question, is, should you start reorganizing your backend into this one database container with a bunch of sources? I have mixed feelings about that. Now, you actually can do this, right? You can go through all your existing databases and start moving them into one container. It's a bit tricky in the situation we have here, where we have this as an inline database container, because it's very hard to figure out what is the actual name of this block, right? We swap through them, right? They have obviously different, it always shows me the database name, but what is the actual block called? But if we turn this here into a page, we all of a sudden see, oh, it has a date, right? So it by default, Notion aggregates the name of both of them, right? So let's just call this instead our database container. And then we see here, since we have now several data sources in it, we can swap between them, and that then shows the corresponding database view name up here. And then if we go now to, let's say, one of our existing previous databases, for example, this demo clients here, I can move it into the container. And you can do so by going to settings and then manage data source. And the next demo clients, right, which is my one source in here, I can say, okay, let's move this, and let's move this to my database container. And you see, okay, if you do this, right, you will move the data source and the one way of looking at it. And we say, yes, let's do this. And then if I go to my database container, we now have contacts, companies, and clients in here. Let's just rename this, right, sort of like it fits the rest of the naming convention. So you can do this. The question is now, should you? Here's where I am a bit on the fence. And I think for now, we will not do this. Neither for our clients nor in our own workspace. We'll, of course, experiment with it. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. But for now, I'll actually probably won't be using this feature. And that has two reasons. A very small technical one, and then more like the overall architecture point of view. Now, the very small technical one is, I'm not sure whether you saw that, but if you use an automation tool like Make, for example, you might have gotten an email that informs you that Notion is dropping some big update and basically they're not yet compatible with it. In sort of the TLDR, this update changes a little bit the way the API and apps interact with Notion. So if the apps that you use, right, haven't yet updated for this new structure, then moving your databases into this source system would mess things up. But by leaving them in the existing previous state, right, everything will continue working. So again, if you have a lot of integrations running, for now, it might just be safer to not make this change. But it's just a small one, right? That's just a question of time until the apps update. But I think even then, I will probably not migrate just yet. And that's because I think we lose a lot of clarity by moving multiple data sources into one database. It might be fine for very simple structures where you say, okay, actually, right, it's really that I just want I want to build a system, right, where I have my complete CRM in one view, right? I have my contacts, I have my companies, and I have the sort of like whoever turns into a client, right? This is all in one place, and I can just tap through them like this. That sounds nice at first, but there are just some very serious downsides with it. First, by moving several sources into one database container, that means you cannot, as easy as before, set up your base views on a database. What do I mean with base views, right? Usually when we build out our databases, we always recommend that on the main instance that you move to your backend, you then create the most important views that you might have to reuse throughout the system. This here is a good example. I recently did a very thorough 2.5-hour video on how to build a Notion setup for VCs. And it follows pretty much our best practices for building these things, which means, of course, we have a backend, right, where all of our databases are listed out. And then in my backend, I can click on any original instance of a database and we set up the standard views that we want to pull into the rest of the system. Now, since this is a demo setup, right, there are only a few views here. But for example, on tasks, you see, okay, we have set up open tasks, my tasks, calendar, board, and done. And this serves two purposes. First, if someone clicks back into the backend and onto the main database, they have actual workable views on there that they can use to slice and dice the data, not just, right, this mass of everything unorganized. And second, it allows you to quickly pull in the most important information when you're building out a new dashboard. Let's say, right, just for the sake of it, you wanted to create a new sample dashboard, right? And you want to pull in something from your tasks. Well, rather than having to rebuild the view, you just say create link view of database, and then we look for VC tasks. And then you see I have all these views that I have set up on the original instance available as quick shortcuts. So I can just with one click, right, pull in my standard board view here. That's right the reason why we set up these views on the main instance. In this case, you can still do this, right? We can have the original one and the view in the same place. So I could now go in, right, and do something like my contacts as a view. But you can imagine, right, if I have 3 data sources, and then per data source, I might have 4 to 5 default views. That's now all of a sudden 15 different views that have to pop up here, maybe even more, which makes it a lot more confusing in the scenario that someone clicks back into the backend and lands on the main database container and then wants to work there. It's something that we generally also discourage, right? We don't want people to go in there too much. We'd rather have them work on the dashboards. But the nature of things is sometimes you have to go to the main database. And then, right, if you now all of a sudden need to pick from 17 views rather than from 3, that makes things a little bit more complex. And then, of course, you have the deletion problem. Again, right now we have contacts and we have my contacts. And what happens now, right, when we start deleting them? Well, if I delete this, right, we delete the view. Okay, that's fine. Now, if I delete this here, right, all of a sudden we get this different pop-up because while we can delete the view only and then still keep the data source, this is also happens to be, right, the main element, the last one from this, right? So let's just say we delete the view only. So now it is gone from here. But if I look at my container, right, I see under manage data sources that we still have demo contacts in here. There's just no view to ever look at it. So the question is, right, okay, like sure, we can create a view now for this and pull it back in there, but it just creates this loop that is very easy, right, particularly for newer users to fall into where already before, right, an issue was that users created too many databases and forgot where they were. Now you can create even more and you can kind of forget where the source was and then try to pull it back out, right? That creates sort of, yeah, a recipe for chaos. Plus, you can achieve this effect, right, of having your companies, your clients, and the general contacts in one location anyway, right? Nothing stops you from setting up your databases as individual databases in the backend. And then on your dashboard, right, wherever you're, let's just call this, our CRM dashboard, wherever you have this, right, then create, just like before, our linked view of databases. And for that, pick our demo contacts and then create another view, pick the demo clients, create another view, pick the demo companies. Right? This has the same scenario. We have our demo contacts, our companies, we can tap through them. We can create as many linked views on there that slice and dice the data exactly the way we need on this view, but we keep our main source separate from this setup. So one last flowchart to bring it all home. This is how I recommend you build your setups. In your Notion workspace, you always want to create one backend. And this might be a separate team space or just a top-level page in your sidebar. And in this backend, you should create separate databases for every single database type. And with a new feature, right, we will start referring to them as database containers with a data source. But what I highly would recommend is that they are always one at a time, that we don't combine several sources into one. So it means, just like before, you have your clients as a separate database/container, and you have your companies as a separate database/container. And then when you want to combine things, also just like before, right, you use a linked view elsewhere in the system. And there you can pull, mix and match as much as you want. So in terms of your actual building recommendations, right, nothing really changed from before. You have the option to combine them, but at this point, I would recommend not to. Now, this point of view might change over time, right? I will experiment with this and see what happens. And again, what I'm very curious to hear how you are going to leverage this new setup. Let me know down below in the comment, right? Are you going to change to this? If so, why, right? What is your reasoning? What are you hoping to get out of this? And if not, why not? In general, right, I think like this is a step in the right direction. It's interesting that we can combine now several sources together and have an easier way to manage it that way. But overall, I don't see the benefits of just this specific step yet. I think what would be a lot more interesting is if we had the option to move databases within databases. Because as you know, if you have, one thing that I think would be a significant step up if we could have a database called backend rather than a page, and then start adding our hints here, right? So for example, I could say, okay, these are my sort of like demo tasks built, right? This is my database here. I turn it into a page, and then it would be nice if I could move it into here, but I can't, right? Regular database in Notion can't contain another database. That only works if you turn it into a wiki, which I would never, ever, ever recommend. Video about that in the description. But yeah, I think that would be a lot more of an interesting feature to organize and group databases together, because that would keep them clean and separate while giving us the option to use properties, right, to identify, okay, who's responsible for this database, when was it last updated, and so on and so on. So I hope that this also comes at some point. And until then, right, I'm going to keep organizing our Notion workspaces with a backend page and individual database containers and sources and use linked views. But yeah, So much about that. Now, we talked a lot about data architecture and systems. So if you want to put all of this into practice, then I recommend you check out this VC build next. Even if you don't run a VC and are not an investor, it's an amazing video that will walk you through everything from going from an empty page to a fully functional Notion setup, both in terms of databases and front end to dashboards. So just click here and I will see you in a second.